Thanks, Todd. As he said, I'm going to be talking about components in Angular 1.5. I'm going to show you the component method that is built into Angular 1.5, and that will allow you to make the migration up to Angular 2 easier once you understand how to use it. Before I get started, I'd like to give you some information about myself. It's a little bit of a trivia thing, so some audience participation is required. I'm going to give you 4 facts, actually 4 items. 3 of them about me are true. 1 of them is false. So at the end of my presentation, I expect you to guess which one is false. So to give you more information about myself, number 1, I have been to 82 countries, and I have climbed the highest mountain on 4 of the 7 continents. Number 2, I graduated from university before IBM introduced the IBM PC, and I earned my MBA before the World Wide Web was introduced. Number 3, I'm blind, colorblind actually, so all of you guys look black and white to me. Number 4, I live in a 400 square foot house, and I actually high-fived Pope John Paul II when he drove past me in his Pope-mobile. So it's up to you at the end of the presentation to figure out which one is not true. So my presentation is about Angular 1.5. My code, if you would like to follow along, I'm going to give you a few slides at the beginning, and then I'm going to actually go through and actually do a live demonstration of building components in Angular 1.5. This is where my code is located. It's on my GitHub repo, so feel free to download it. It actually has 2 branches, the master branch, which is what I'm going to be working from, where I'll have everything from the start. And then there is a perfect branch, which is the final version of the application, so if you want to look at the final version. So give you some background about why there are components in Angular 1.5. Angular was released last year in September. React is also rapidly growing in popularity. Both of those are component-based architectures. Angular JS is not. But with Angular JS 1.5, they provided the components to give you that same functionality that was there. When you use components in Angular JS, you realize that it's nothing more than syntactic sugar for a directive. Anything that you can do with a directive, you can do with a component and vice versa. But there's a little things that make them easier to use with the component, because there's a little bit less that you actually have to type in to use a component than you do with a directive. And they also default to the industry's best practices that have been established in using directives and components within Angular. So you're able to take advantage of those best practices by using a component. And then it also, by using components in your Angular JS code, it makes it a little bit easier to actually upgrade to Angular 2. So let me see a show of hands. How many of you are using Angular JS right now? Okay. How many of you are using Angular 2? Okay. How many of you are actually using Angular JS 1.5 or higher? Okay, perfect. When you look at what's in a component in Angular JS 1.5, you're going to see, as I said earlier, it makes it a little bit easier to use than using a directive, and it allows for the best practices. And what gives you those best practices is that the component is, by default, it has isolate scope. It uses a controller instead of link functions, and it automatically sets the controller as syntax, so you don't have to set controller as like you used to do with a directive. And then the bind to controller is set by default, so you can actually skip that option that you used to have to define within a directive. So to give you a comparison between the two, here's what you used to use when using a directive. You would come in, you would actually have to define a function that returns an object. That object would then have a scope. Then you would have your template URL, or template if you were doing inline templates. You would have the name of your controller or the controller function itself right there. Then you would have the controller as syntax and the bind to controller. So you had to put in quite a bit of information just to use a basic directive. Now, if you look at the same thing in a component, you'll see that there's less information that you actually have to type in. Number one, you're actually not writing a function that returns an object. You actually just give it the object itself in the component. So you can skip that step there. You have the bindings that allow you to do the one-way and two-way data binding in the component. You have the template URL, which is there like it was previously. And then you have the controller, which was there previously. But you do not have to come in and add the controller as line and the bind to controller that you had previously. So it makes it a little bit easier to write your information with the component than it does with a directive. Some new features that are built into components when you're using them in Angular JS 1.5 and higher is it provides one-way data binding. Normally what you would have is with the component, if you have your parent component and you have your child component, if you pass something into the child component and then you make a change to that value, then it would be passed back up to the parent because you had the two-way data binding. With Angular JS 1.5, you have the option of doing one-way data binding. And what that means is that if you have your parent component and you have your child component and you pass something into the child, if you change it there, it does not come back up and get changed on the parent. Now, there is one if in terms of that thing that it doesn't get changed in one-way data binding. If you have an object that you're passing into the child component, if you make a change to that object, then it will be passed back up to the parent. And that's because when you pass in an object, both the parent and the child are looking at the same object because it's passing it in by reference. So you have to be aware that if you're using objects, that there is a possibility that even though you have one-way data binding set, that it can be updated in the parent itself. Some other things that it provides with Angular JS 1.5 components is that you have lifecycle hooks. This gives you the ability of when in the lifecycle of the component that you can actually put in commands and methods that will actually run at set times in the life of that component. This is a thing that was popular in Angular 2, and they're bringing that feature down into Angular JS. And the other thing that you can have is actually you can have a stateless components. When I get through and I start doing the live programming, I will actually show you an example of a stateless component. And a stateless component is where you have a parent component and a child component, and you really don't want to put anything like a pass in a state to that child component. You may just want it to display some basic HTML, and it doesn't matter what people are going to do on it. You don't care, so you don't need to put it back. So you can end up with stateless components, and we'll actually go through and do some that are based off of that. Some of the lifecycle events that you have in 1.5 is on init, which means after all the bindings have taken place, then the on init would fire, so you can actually put in some code there. You can also do a post link on changes if anything happens in the component, and then you also have the on destroy when the component has finished. So that gives you some information about components. And what I'm going to do as part of my live demonstration is we're actually going to create this. I work for a startup company in Atlanta that's called Hearst Autos. How many of you have ever heard of Car and Driver or Road and Track magazines? Or have visited Car and Driver's website? Hearst Autos is the company that runs that website. So we are in the process right now within our company of redoing our website from PHP into Angular, and we're taking advantage of all these components functionalities. So we'll go through and we'll actually see how we're actually building this website that's on there. So if you look at from a high-level standpoint of how all of these components are put together, normally they're put together by what's called a component tree. At the very high level, we have our app component. This is what's going to start everything in our component. The app component actually has two child components. One is our basic navigation, and then one is our car picker. And our car picker, if I come back over here, our car picker is basically this part down at the bottom where it has the research vehicles, that has the drop-down select for you choose your make, your model, and then you can click on research and get more information about the make and model that you've selected. So that's what our car picker has, and our car picker will have three components underneath it. It will have the show makes select, it would have the show models select, and then it's the button that will actually appear after you've selected a make and model. And then once you click on the button, the last thing that I'm going to show in my demonstration is the CarInfo. And the CarInfo will actually be nothing more than the picture of the car, the make and model that you've selected, and a little bit of text about it, and then a title that tells you exactly what make and model that you're currently looking at. When you look at the application that we're going to be creating, this is going to be the folder structure that we're going to be using. We have in our root, we have our index.html that's going to be displaying our information. We're going to have a folder for our style sheets. We're going to have a vendor folder, which I don't expand here in the slide, but that basically has just our Angular JS files. I'm going to be using UI select for our select statement, so it has those things that I'll be using on there. But the main thing that we'll be working with is the components folder. And in the components folder, I have a folder broken down for every one of the components that we are going to build in the component tree that I showed you earlier. And they will all be in that one folder. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to do a live demo, so I'm going to break out of this. And again, this is my repo. My GitHub account is github.com/ratracegrad, which is my GitHub account. And here is the GitHub repo that you can see. And this is Car and Driver's website. And what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this navigation right here. And then we're going to create a car picker that will contain all of this information, that will have the show makes component, the show models component, the show button. And then once you click on the show button, we're going to have a CarInfo component that's actually going to show you that information about that individual car. So to get started, what we have here is a basic application. And can everybody read that okay? All right, good. This is actually how I actually read on my IDE every day because I have poor eyesight. So what we have here is a very beginning, a basic application, HTML that has nothing but hello world in it. It has, all the Angular files that I'm loading in. It's got my style sheets loaded at the top. And then it's got my app.js. And if we come over and look at the app.js, right now it's just a very simple Angular app that we have available. And if we check it out, we can come over here and we can look at it, pull it up in a browser, and we can see that we have this basic application that we're going to start with that has Hello World on it. So to get started, what we're going to start with is our navigation. So what we have in the components is I have a navigation folder, and we have a navigation.html file and a navigation.js file. And in order to create my navigation, what I've done is I've gone out to Bootstrap, and they have some samples if you've ever been to getbootstrap.com. And this is the sample, and if you look at the source code on that sample, this is the information that they have for the navigation. and I'm taking that navigation information, and I'm going to take it over here, and I'm going to come into my navigation.html, and I'm putting it in, and simply because I'm just using some shortcuts to make it a little bit easier and faster, so as you're not watching me type in all these lines of text that are in here. I've taken the navigation that I borrowed from the Git Bootstrap, and there's only a couple of things that I've changed on that information that I've copied over. I put in the name of car and driver, so that's the name of our website, and then by default, that navigation gave me 3 things on the navigation itself. So what I've done is I've changed those to new cars, reviews, and news, and the reason why I've changed them is that just corresponds to the first 3 items that are in our navigation. So we've put that in, we have it available to us. Now what we have is we have to put in our component information. So this is creating our very first component that we're going to be using. We go out and get access to our Angular module, which I'm calling car and driver, and we're going to create a component, and I'm calling this component navigation. And in that navigation, it has the very basic minimum amount of information that you need in order to create a component. And that tells it that it's looking for this HTML file, which is what I just created with the navigation that's on there. Now, to be able to use that, I actually have to come back into my application and add this navigation script file. So I'm going to put that in there, and then in order for it to show up, I actually have to put it in here in the body itself. So now what I've done is I've added the script tag for my navigation, and then this is where I'm going to display it, is I'm going to display it directly into the body of my application. So if I come back over here and I open this up in the browser, I now have my very first component that we've created, and it's a simple navigation, and it corresponds to car and driver and the first 3 menu items that are out there on our website. So now that we've got that in, the next thing that we want to do is we want to start creating our car picker component. And our car picker is going to kind of be the brains behind most of what we're going to be doing from here on out, because it's going to control all of the child components for showing the make, the model, and the button itself. So I'm going to close out of this, and if I come over here to my car picker, and I'm going to give it, here is my basic information that I'm going to put in the HTML. And when you look at what's in here, we're going to be adding more about it as we go along. And this corresponds to, on our website, nothing more than basically this header and subheader that's on here. So I've got this information, it's got the information that's on there. So now I'm going to go out and put my JavaScript in for my component. And it follows pretty much the same outline that we created for our navigation component. I've got a little bit more information. Not only do I have my template, which we just created in the HTML, but I also now have added a controller to it. And on this controller for car picker, I'm adding 2 basic static variables that I have on there for selected make and selected model. And I'm putting that in for right now because when you come over here and you look, when a user selects a make and when they select a model, that's going to be stored in the selected make and the selected model because I will need that information later on. So this is what we've got in our basic component itself. And then we come in and the same thing that we did here. We're going to add this in, and we're going to add our car picker so that it shows up underneath our navigation. And to see how we're doing, if we open this up, we now have 2 components that we've created, one for our navigation and one for our car picker. So now, the next thing that we want to go through is after we've got this, I'm going to actually leave these up, is now we're going to do our makes. So we'll come in, and our makes is going, and our component is going to have its JavaScript file, and it's going to have its, now, let me show you something that I've put in here for this component for makes, is it's got its template URL that it's going to. It's got its controller. Now, this is your first example of using bindings within a component itself. And what I'm doing is I'm passing into it a binding of make, and I'm setting it for two-way data binding. And I want it two-way data binding because when they select a make, like if they select Ford or Kia or Mercedes or some other make, I need to know that because I need to use that information to display the models associated with the make that they've put in there. And in my controller, I'm just hard coding right here information about all the different makes that I'm going to be showing in the drop-down. Ultimately, what you would want to do in a bigger application would be pulling this information from a database so that you have it available to you. And I've got just a small handful of different makes that I'm going to be using for this demonstration. And since I'm going to be using UI select to actually display the makes, I've got all the makes in key value pairs so that they can show up on there. So we've got our makes, and then we're coming here and we put in our HTML code. And our HTML code is it's basic, simple bootstrap terminology. I'm using a 5-column width column, and I'm going to use 5 widths for my make. I'm going to use 5 for my model, and that leaves me 2 of the 12 that are available for my button at the very end. And I'm going to be using UI select, so this is nothing more than the formatting for the UI select. And I'm telling it to basically go through and have it loop through all of the makes that are in my makes, in my controller, and display those in my drop-down that I have available to us. So now that we've got that in, we'll have to come back over here, and we're going to add the scripts in for the makes. Now, instead of putting information about the makes directly into the index.html, I need this to go into the carpicker.html file. So if I come over here and I look at my car picker that's in there, and what I can do is, there we've got where it's showing our component that we've just created in here. So what I'm passing into it, because I've got that bindings for two-way data binding for make, I'm telling it that what I'm passing into it is the selected make variable that we created in our car picker component. And it's going to be two-way data binding. So when they select something and it comes back out, then I will be able to see that. And if everything is in here and wired up together, when we come back over and look at it, we now are able to see from our drop-down every single one of our makes that we have available to us. So I'm going to close some of these windows out so that we have them. So now that we've got our makes in, what I can do is I can come back over here and I can close this information out. And now the next thing that we want to do is we want to go through and do our models. And it's going to be, for our models, the layout is going to be pretty much the same. It's going to be a UI select that has, put that in the wrong place. It has the same UI select that we have on there. And what I'm going to use is I'm going to go through and I'm going to go through all the models that are in my controller, and based on the make that was selected, I'm going to actually show the models that correspond to that. So when you come over here, the way that that works is that In my models, I've got my component. I've got the template URL for the HTML that we just put in. We've got our bindings. Now, in this case, I actually have two things that I'm going to be binding to this component. One is the actual make that's coming in, and then the next one is the model. The make, I'm putting it as one-way data binding. I don't care what goes on with the make that's in here at this point. I do care about what model they select, because once they select the model, then that is going to trigger the showing of the button to get the research about that information. And in my controller, I have created just a basic object, that has an array of models. And each model has its key, for example, Buick, and then this is the list of models that I've put in there. So that gives us some information that we can use to test on as we go through things. So now that we've put that in there, so we'll add this into our app.js, so we add that component that's in there. And then in our carpicker.html, we're going to put in this information for our model. And what we're going to do is, here's our component that we're putting in, is we have our component for models. And then what we have is we have our thing that we're passing in, because remember on the bindings, we had two different items that we were passing in to the application itself. So we have the selected make, and then we have the selected model. And I'm actually going to hide it until the selected make actually has a value that's in it. Because remember, when we created our carpicker.js component, our selected make and selected models by default had a value of null. And those will be filled in as the user selects things from the drop-down menu. So that we've got this information in, we've got everything in, and then we come over here and we select a make, and then from there we're actually able to see the different models. And if I wanted to select a different make, I'm able to see the different make that's available on there. So just to recap on what we've done so far, we started off with the basic navigation that was a stateless component. All it did was just HTML that was on there. Then from there, we created a car picker component that's going to be kind of like the hearts of what we're going to have on there. And that's going to have our selected make and our selected model that's on there. Then underneath that, we created a show makes component, and that uses two-way data bindings. Then we created a show models, and that actually had two different bindings that were available to it. One item was one-way data binding, and then the other item had two-way data binding on it. So that gives you an idea of what we've put in so far. So the next thing that we want to do is actually to go through, and let me get rid of some of these files, and we're going to now put in our button. And our button, when we look at it, it actually doesn't have an HTML file. So this shows you that you can actually use inline templates. So before, every other component that we've created up to now had a template URL, and the template URL went to a separate HTML file where we had all of our HTML code available to us that we could access. Now what we're going to do with this component is we're basically going to do inline HTML, and we're going to basically tell it that we're going to have a button, and the button is going to have the word research on it. So it's as simple as we can get it, that we can put it in there. So in order to use it, we'll come over here and add the button in for ourselves on there. And then what we'll do is in our carpicker.html, scroll back over. And this is where we actually show the button. And what we're going to do is we're going to hide the button based on when you actually select a model that's on there. And then what we're going to do is when you actually click on the button, it's going to execute a method that we're going to call go-to-info. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail as we go through on the information for the button itself. So, all right, let me see. Now, what I've done is I've come in and I've taken my car picker and I've added some functionality to it. Everything that was in there before stopped right here with the selected make and the selected model. And I've put in this function for go-to-info. And what go-to-info is going to do is actually use routing to go through and actually display the details and information about the particular car that we've selected. And what we're going to do is we're going to get into that function. We're going to get two variables for make and model that are based on what the users have selected. And then we're going to do a state with the UIRouter to go to car details. That will actually pass into it the make and model that the user has selected. And what we're trying to duplicate when we go through something along that lines is if you come over here and, for example, you select Ford Escape and you click research, notice if you can see at the very top, the URL that's being displayed here is it's our website, carandriver.com / the make that you've selected / and then the model. So that therefore we can pull the information that you've selected and then be able to display the information that's particular to that make and model that you've selected on there. So that's what we're trying to accomplish in our routing so that it makes it generic so that it will work with any make and any model that's available out there. So we come back over here, and if I've got everything put in, I can select a Buick, an Enclave, and now I have my button that shows up once I've selected both the make and the model. Now, the last component that we're going to put in is our CarInfo. And our CarInfo is actually what's going to display the picture of the car and the text and information about the make and model that you've selected. And then when you look at the HTML that's in here, it's going to basically have an image of the car that you've selected, and then it's going to have some information that's on there. So at the very top, it's going to have the make and model as a heading information, and then it's going to have the image, and then it's going to have the car info, and it's going to have the image in a 6-column wide image of the car, and then 6-column wide details about the actual car that we have available to us. So we put that in, and what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to make that so we add the script in that we have for our car. Now, in order for the routing to work, I'm going to have to come back in and I'm going to have to add that routing functionality into my application. So in my original app, I have my config that has this information on here. And I'm going to actually make a couple of changes to the applications right now to allow for the navigation to work correctly and properly. And what I have is I've added UIRouter in here, and I've got two routes. I have my home route, and what that's going to do is it's going to display a very basic component called car picker. And then if I click on the button for research, it's actually going to go to a URL that's going to give you your make and your model, similar to what I showed you from our current navigation. And then it's going to actually display the car info that's in there. So in order for that to work, we have a new component that's called app. And in our app, it's basically going to have the HTML file and then the controller that's on there, which right now doesn't have any functionality on it. And if you look at the HTML file, it's going to have the header and the body so that it provides both navigation for us. And on my index.html, I'm actually going to come back and I'm going to take this out, and what we'll see is in here, I've created a component called car and driver that's in my app. So when I come in here, I'm actually can just come in here and I can put in car and driver as my component, because now it's going to display the navigation and the information and the content based on which one of the two routes that I'm currently on. So I've put that information in, and I now need to also add in information for this other new component that I've put in. So that it's available to us also. And if we come back over and we look at this and we have it displayed in the website, we can select a make, we can select a model, we can click research, and oh crap, it doesn't work. Hate it when that happens. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to come over here and we're going to switch over to one other thing. All right, let's see if we can figure out what I've missed on here. We've got to put our car information in. So we've got our car information.html, and we have to put in our cars. So therefore, what it has is it has the information so it knows what to actually display based, and we have in here is our cars.json. So in here with our CarInfo, we have our JavaScript that has information that's on there, and then we have our CarInfo.html. So I talked about the HTML file in the beginning, and then in our CarInfo.javascript file, the component itself, it's going to actually do an HTTP call to this JSON file, and it's going to pass into it what make and model that you've done, and it's going to get the information for that particular car. So in our cars.json file, it's just a plain, simple JSON file. It has, for example, here's my make, here are the models that are available for Buick, and then if I selected, for example, Buick Enclave, here is the URL for the image, and here is the information that's actually going to be displayed on the page for you. So now that we've got that in, come back and display. And what we've got now is we've got the information that's displayed for a single car. So just to recap, what we've gone through is I've shown you different ways of creating components. One, the simplest way of creating is a stateless component that we use for our navigation. I've shown you how to do one-way data binding within a component, how to do two-way data binding within a component, how to have multiple things in a binding in a single component, and then how to take advantage of that information and using routing so that you can have it so that it allows you to display information for a particular car that's available out there. So that gives you some information on components. And if I go back to my demo, just a quick plug for my company, Hearst Autos. We're located in Atlanta, Georgia. We are hiring. Our website, as you showed, is carandriver.com. We're currently porting it over to Angular 2. We're hiring, so if you are a developer that has some experience, especially with Angular 2, we would love to talk to you. Our website gets over 12 million unique visitors per month, 100 million pages viewed per month. We have a lot of followers on Facebook. We have a lot of followers on Twitter, but not as much as the president, unfortunately. But we're looking to overcome that. Our tech stack that we're using is Angular 2, Node and Express on the back end, and then we use Docker for our deployment. If you're interested, here's the information about myself. My website is jenniferbland.com. My GitHub account, you can go there and get the actual code for the demonstration for today. If you're interested in learning more about the jobs, or if you have any questions, my email address is ratracegrad@gmail.com, and ratracegrad is also my Twitter account. So now, back to you guys. This is where I told you it has some audience participation required. At the beginning of my presentation, I gave you 4 facts about myself. So anybody want to take a guess on which one of those 4 items is not true? Yes? I'm sorry? Okay. Anybody else? I did high-five Pope John Paul II on the last Easter Sunday that he did before he passed away. And I have been to 82 countries, and I have climbed the highest mountain on 4 continents. And I am not colorblind. I can clearly see that you have a red shirt on and yours is blue. So I appreciate you attending my presentation today. Let me know if you have any questions and I'll be glad to answer them.
I have a question. The first one about the component that will automatically have a controller as value. Can we override that to give a different name?
You can. By default with components, the controller as functionality is built in, and it uses $CTRL as the value that you're giving it. If you want to override it, when you go into your component, you can actually go in and say controller as and give it a new name, a new value. So if you don't want to use $controller, which you saw in my demonstration, that's what I was using because that's the default. Yes, you can definitely override it to anything else. I didn't understand the first part of your question.
So what's the difference between init and constructor?
Oh, I got it. Sorry, I couldn't understand. I don't know the main difference between the two, so I don't know how to answer that question. So, all right. Any other questions? Thank you again for attending. If you get a chance, I'd love for you to provide feedback on the app for this presentation. Don't forget to go to my GitHub repo, and you can download the application so you can get the example code for itself. Thank you very much.